In fact, Qumran there is no comparison to what was found in Qumran. We have no other Jewish archive from the ancient period.
Are the Dead Sea Scrolls just a collection of random manuscripts in caves, or should we be thinking of them more as a library? Hey, I'm Jordan, and this is the Bible and Archaeology podcast, the place for conversations and questions about the lands, civilizations, and archaeology of the Bible. This week, we are turning to one of the most famous things in the world of Bible and archaeology, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we're joined by Dr. Sidnie White Crawford to talk some about the background of the scrolls and another way that maybe we should be considering them to bring a new perspective to their connection to the people, the sites, the caves, and their world, by thinking of the scrolls as a library. If you are interested in the world of the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think you are really going to enjoy this conversation. Remember, for early access to ad-free video podcasts and exclusive bonus content like a weekly bonus podcast where we are walking through the Bible, a chapter or two at a time, both the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, and the New Testament, you can join us over on Patreon. We are Bible and Arc on Patreon. But for now, settle in, and I hope you enjoy our conversation all about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Dr. Crawford, thank you so much for taking the time to come and join us today for a conversation about one of people's favorite things, I think, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Maybe favorite in name, but also maybe not as well known. So happy to have you with us today to bring some additional insight and clarity into these famous artifacts.
It's my pleasure to be here with you today, and I think that you absolutely introduced it correctly. Most people have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they really don't know or understand what that necessarily means.
Can we start right there then? Because I do think these are one of those names. It's the name that gets TV shows. You're going to get episodes that have this because everyone goes, yeah, I know that name, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And for you, when you go to introduce this, whether to students or to people on the airplane who are like, what do you do when you throw this out? And they go, oh, I've heard that before. How do you present the Dead Sea Scrolls in that quick explanation of kind of what they are, where they came from, and why they matter in that succinct way, I guess, to remind everyone before we jump into the deep end today?
Sure. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are kind of an umbrella term that stands for a whole series of manuscript discoveries that were made along the western shore of the Dead Sea in the 1940s and 50s, really up until the 1960s. And there were 5 main sites where scrolls were discovered. The first is, I'm going north to south now. The first is the Wadi Dahlia Samaria papyri, which the Wadi Dahlia is located north of Jericho. So that's the northernmost site. The second site, and probably the most famous, is Qumran, which is an archaeological site located on the northwest corner of the Dead Sea. And about 1,000 different manuscripts were located in that region in 11 manuscript caves. Then moving further south, we have the caves of the Wadi Murabaat, which revealed documents and literature from the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, that is the Common Era. The Nahal Hever documents also date from that time a little further south. And then finally, the last site is the Herodian fortress of Masada, which is famous for the last stand of the Jews during the Great Jewish Revolt against Rome. So those 5 sites comprise the Dead Sea Scrolls. Today, I think we will mostly be talking about the Qumran scrolls because that's the largest find, the most varied find, and probably the most important. So that's kind of that gives you a geographical location. Let me say that these manuscripts, they date from the 4th century BCE, before the Common Era, all the way to the 2nd century CE. They were written in Hebrew, in Aramaic, a language related to Hebrew, Greek, and then some later ones in Latin. So all of the ancient languages you can think of at that time. And they were written both on, both on treated animal skin, sometimes called parchment, and papyrus, as well as ostraca, which are broken pottery sherds that people used kind of as their notepaper of the time. So there's the capsule description of the scrolls.
And in a way that I think also, as you noted here, does introduce probably more questions for people, because Qumran is the name that most people know. And there will probably be some surprise for some listeners hearing that there are other caves. There's a wider variety of caves maybe than they had originally thought about. So in setting some of that up too, how do you frame the connections for someone who's hearing that for the first time and thinking, I thought all of these were tied to this site Qumran that I've heard of, and now you're telling me that there are caves spread out and there are other sites. Are all of these things connected? Are they not connected? How do you start to frame that as soon as you've, raised the eyebrows there?
They are both connected and not connected. How is that for an answer? They are, except for the Samaria papyri, they are all documents of Jews in the Second Temple period. The Samaria papyri were owned by Samaritans, which of course is a kind of denomination in a sense that is closely related to Judaism. They are all culturally connected. They are all part of the same historic period, which makes them very important. In the case of the last four sites that I mentioned, starting with Qumran, all of them contained manuscripts that reflect the later Jewish Bible, what Christians refer to as the Old Testament. So that's another area of continuity. On the other hand, they were placed in the caves in which they were found, or the places they were found, for different reasons. At Qumran, we have a site that lasted for about 150 years, and it seems to have been a functioning library until very close to its destruction by the Romans in 68, when the majority of the manuscripts were hidden in the caves. In the case of Nahal Hever and Marabaat, these were refugee caves, and they were people fleeing either during the Great Jewish Revolt against Rome, they took refuge in the caves, or during the Second Jewish Revolt against Rome under Bar Kokhba. And so as a result, there are a lot more personal documents, marriage contracts, deeds, letters, those kind of things. And two of the most famous actually belonged to women, Babatha and Salome Komais, who fled for whatever reason, we're not quite sure, except they were in trouble and they had to flee. But they took their personal archives with them. And that has just given us an enormous amount of information about sort of everyday life in this period. And then in Masada, because it was the last refuge of Jews who had been in Jerusalem and had fled south once the Romans took Jerusalem in the year 70, you do find some biblical manuscripts, but you also find some personal documents again. So there are differences among the collections. The reason Qumran stands out is that it is almost entirely religious texts. Mm-hmm. There are very, very, very few, like 5 non-religious or documentary texts. There's a couple of deeds of sale and a couple of lists of like grain products, but it's religious documents, and that really makes it stand out. That's very rare to find something like that. In fact, Qumran there is no comparison to what was found in Qumran. We have no other Jewish archive from the ancient period, and the only comparable one would be the Cairo Geniza from the medieval period.
You've mentioned here archive and library, which are two terms that you have used in your work previously to try to reframe some of how maybe we consider these scrolls, these caves, the way that they're coming together. Because if people have done some reading or study before, they might have varied ideas depending on who they've heard talk about these for maybe how they ended up in the caves. And we can get to that in a little bit. But as far as the uniqueness of Qumran and this classification of library, could we turn to that? Because I think it's such a fascinating way to reframe suddenly how we think about it and the communities that might be attached to them. So what would a library mean or look like in this context? Is it like it is for us where there's a public library or university libraries and it's close to our understanding, or do we need to do some real reframing to understand
We need to
that?
do some reframing, right? We think of, when we say the word library, we tend to first of all think of a building, right? Where you go and you can nowadays get books, magazines, but other kind of media things. You can download audiobooks. But there's a building that you go to and you get a card and you do this, and it's usually open to everyone. Then we have university libraries which are only open to members of the university community. We also have some private libraries in the United States. They tend to be associated with museums, so that, say you wanted to go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and do research, they have a library that you could get permission to use. But we tend to think of libraries as public access places, and that was not true in the ancient world, because books, manuscripts were expensive, and they were the product of the elites, and there was a very low rate of literacy in the ancient world. Some estimates are 1 to 2% of the population. So if someone had the ability to read and write at a very high level, they were a professional, and their job was to produce these very precious manuscripts for the people who own them. I think, again, the closest analogy that we might be familiar with is the medieval monastery, where you always, you see pictures of the monks as scribes working away. Who were they producing these things for? For the most part, for themselves, although they could also earn some money by doing it for someone else. But they were producing it for themselves, for this closed community. And I think that when we talk about literary productions, and that is the myths, the writings of the particular society, we're talking about a very elite activity. There were lower level scribes who could produce documents like wills or deeds of sale or short letters that people could use. But they were kind of, they didn't get the elite training. They stayed at the lower level and probably earned a very nice living, but we're not talking about them when we talk about the Qumran library. There we're talking about an elite level of scribes who not only could read and write, but knew the cultural heritage of ancient Israel, probably in their heads much better than we do. We are not people who memorize easily, just because we have so much written material available to us. I remember having to memorize poems or speeches when I was in school, and it was always really hard because we're not used to doing that. We memorize music very easily. If you think of people who sing and sing songs, people do that really easily. Ask someone for advertising jingles and they can just spit them out, but not written products. So we still have the capacity, we just don't use it.
What types of texts are most commonly associated with these libraries, if we're trying to put Qumran as a library in conversation with maybe some other examples that might
Right.
exist, whether it's in ancient Israel or in the broader ancient world, are they representative here of what we might find, or is that another place of uniqueness?
They are representative in the case in the fact that they represent the cultural heritage of ancient Israel. When we look at other libraries that we can use as a comparative, we're looking either at libraries in Egypt or in Mesopotamia, because there's nothing that's been found that's comparable in ancient Israel. So in time, the closest library is the famous Library of Alexandria, which was established by the Ptolemaic dynasty in the late 4th, early 3rd centuries. And it was called, actually, it wasn't called the library, it was called the Museon, which is a gathering of scholars. And they were provided with papyrus rolls, with the cultural heritage. So, and what does that mean? Well, this would be the cultural heritage of ancient Greece. So if you think of the Greek that's a hard word to say, tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, or the famous poets, Pindar, Sappho, philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, and of course the epics from Homer and Hesiod. That was the cultural capital of ancient Greece that they then built on and worked with. That's what was housed at the Museon in the library in Alexandria. The same was true at the library in Pergamum in Asia Minor, which was kind of established as a rival to the library at Alexandria. So again, that cultural capital. And then we can look at earlier libraries in Mesopotamia, such as the great library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, and he was doing the same thing. So those are the best comparatives we have for what the library at Qumran looks like. Now, we know who was collecting the library at Alexandria. We know who was collecting the library of Ashurbanipal.
He likes to tell us that who was
right,
doing
he
that
likes
one.
to tell us that. That's right. The library at Qumran is a little more mysterious. We don't know. They don't tell us who is doing the collecting. They don't tell us why they're doing the collecting. We can make some very educated guesses about it. And they don't really tell us how they brought all this material together. So we have to look at the collection itself, the physical setting it's found in, and then at the comparatives and say, can we make a reasonable reconstruction of what's going on at Qumran?
The physical location itself feels like, I guess, a point to ask an immediate question on, compared to some libraries that you've set out that are so directly connected to major sites within power centers. And then if you're turning to Qumran, you might be a little surprised to say, well, if those are libraries and that's where they're located, how does Qumran align with some of that? Because it feels a little potentially out of the way for it to be a
lot out
library.
of the way for anyone who has ever been there, right? It's even now it's not a site kind of on the major tourist routes.
Right.
And in the ancient world, it would have been even more kind of out of the way. The nearest major cultural center would have, of course, been Jerusalem, with the temple located there and the seat of at least Jewish government, although not Roman government. And we know there was a library in the temple from the testimony of Josephus and then the testimony of the later rabbis. Unfortunately, most likely when the Romans burned the Second Temple in 70, the library went with it. We know that Titus took some scrolls out and took them to Rome, but most of it would have been gone. And since the Temple Mount has never been excavated down to the Second Temple level, we can't really say much about what the physical location would have been. But that would have been the nearest place. Now, Qumran is quite different. It's a very small settlement. It maybe housed 50 people at once. It's not a city. It's not a town. It's just one cluster of buildings that seems to have housed a group of Jewish men who were living a communal lifestyle. And what I mean by that is that they were sharing living quarters, and they were sharing all the facilities, and they were sharing food and water and all of those things. They weren't living in discrete family units as we normally would find in towns and villages. So even in that sense, it's a very anomalous site. So they do have buildings where they had mundane activities, right? They had a kitchen where they baked their bread. They had a mill for grinding flour. They had a pottery kiln for making pots. But then they also had at least two or one set of rooms that seems to have been associated with scroll production and dissemination in some way. Of course, it doesn't say this is our library on the lintel. So we have to, again, look at the comparanda and say, does this have features that are compatible with housing a library? And there are in the main building, in the northeast quadrant of that main building. However,
what would those features be? I guess for someone who's immediately thinking like, okay, if I'm imagining maybe someone's been and they've walked through and they're thinking to themselves, they look like a lot of rooms or the remains of rooms, which don't look that different one to the other as I walked through them. So what are the features that allow someone like yourself to come in and say, this one is different and might open itself up to being a library?
So there's one set of rooms that looks like it has the features of a library. And those features are, first of all, that you have a courtyard that would have allowed light in. Because remember, no electricity. How did you read? You needed a really good source of natural light. Secondly, there seems to have been wall niches in the walls. And those could be used either for shelves on which you just stacked your scrolls, or cupboards that you could insert into the niches and then open them up, and there the scrolls would be stacked. There also was a low bench or podium that went around one of the rooms, and that seems to have been used in libraries that we know are libraries as places where people reading would sit and read, because people didn't sit in nice chairs and, with desks. They sat either on a bench or even on the ground, and they just opened the scroll on their lap and they read, and they even copied scrolls that way. It's as difficult as that seems to us. That simply was the way they did it. And the final feature, and I think this is really important, is that it had a locked door. Now, how do we know that, right? Because when it was excavated, there were found a pattern of nails in the shape of a door and a lock that indicated that it had been locked. Now, the door itself, being made of wood, had completely perished, but you had this nice door pattern there. So this was some kind of, whatever was in it, it had to have been important enough to want to lock the door. Next to it was another room in which were found plastered tables, plastered benches, some kind of water facility, and remnants of inkwells, a needle. Those are the kind of things that you used when you were copying or preparing scrolls. Again, it doesn't say on the lintel, this is where we copied scrolls, but it at least is compatible with that activity. The other thing I should say is that in the ancient world, people didn't have discrete rooms that they used for only one thing. So they could have been doing different things in these rooms, as well as keeping their scrolls, working on their scrolls, repairing their scrolls. So there might be other features or other things they were doing. But those are the features that I think indicate at least that there's some kind of scribal activity going on in the buildings themselves. Then you have the caves. And there are really two discrete sets of caves. The first set are up in the limestone cliffs, and they're natural caves. And I'm going to return to those because they have very different features. But on the same plateau that Qumran sits, the buildings, they dug out of kind of the edges of that plateau human-made caves. And they seem to have used these caves for various functions, maybe for sleeping, but also for, again, there seems to have been a scroll workshop. They had a lot of scroll tabs and ties, over 100 in one cave. Either someone had a really weird collection, or it was a workshop where you attached tabs and ties to the scrolls. And then in caves 4 and 5, cave 4 was the major manuscript cave, when both the Bedouin who first discovered them and then the archaeologists came in, what they found were scrolls just stacked on the floor. And that looks like it was some kind of storage facility, whether it was a long-term storage facility that was in use during the life of the settlement. I think that's entirely possible. It's also clear it was used as a quick hiding place when the Romans were approaching. Get all the scrolls out, hide them away, we'll come back. And they didn't. So all of those caves actually are considered by archaeologists part of the lived environment of Qumran. We don't make a distinction between the buildings and the caves. People were walking around in between them and up and down and all the time. So they considered them part of their house, as it were. So those caves are really important to understanding what was going on at Qumran. Now, the natural limestone cliff caves are farther away, and you can't live in them. They have very uneven floors and ceilings. Sometimes you have to just crawl in to get into them. They have no natural light. They're infested with bats and other things. So what was happening there? Well, they seem to have been taking scrolls, storing them in ceramic jars, and putting those jars in those caves. And once the cave got full or finished, whatever, we're not quite sure, they would seal it up and leave. So that seems to have been what I have called a permanent storage facility. Other people have said, well, it's a geniza. And a geniza, of course, in Jewish tradition is where old manuscripts that are no longer used or cannot be used anymore were stored. And the idea was that eventually they would be buried if they were sacred religious texts in some way. And so some people, Joan Taylor is the most prominent, have argued that that's in fact what they were doing in the limestone cliff caves. They were burying scrolls. I think she really has marshaled her evidence quite nicely. I'm not quite sure we can say with absolute certainty that they were Genizot. So I prefer to say long-term storage, but maybe that's a dodge. I don't know.
Well, and you've touched on here, there's a lot of debate with Qumran, with the Dead Sea Scrolls. With anything having to do with archaeology, there's always differences of interpretation, but especially here,
Exactly.
There's ripe debate around the community, who might be there, the scrolls, how they might have gotten into the caves. And so could I ask, when we're talking about long-term storage or short-term storage, who might have been at the community, potential relationships between the community and the caves, do you feel like this answer of library and library use with the caves solves any problems that some other explanations that have sought to explain how the scrolls got to the caves or the relationship between the scrolls and the caves and the site have left unanswered in the past?
Absolutely. There have been, as you said, there have been myriad explanations for what's going on at Qumran. I want to distinguish kind of between two sets. There is the first hypothesis that this was the dwelling place of a particular Jewish group who were, among other things, collecting and storing scrolls. That is the major hypothesis, and it is generally accepted by everyone. Who they were, why they were doing it, all of those questions can be up for debate. The second sort of set of hypotheses are kind of one-off hypotheses, right? Someone suggested it was a fortress. Someone has suggested it was a pottery production center. Someone has suggested it was a commercial entrepot on the Dead Sea. None of those hypotheses have gotten more than a handful of adherents, usually just the person who came up with it. And usually their explanation for the scrolls is either I'm ignoring them or the scrolls just came from Jerusalem and got put in the caves and they have nothing to do with Qumran. And that is ignoring a lot of archaeological evidence that tie the caves to the site and the caves to each other. And so those kind of theories just need to be put aside. Now, within the main theory, is there room for debate? There's lots of room for debate because they don't tell us anything, right? I mean, this is what you're doing when you're talking about ancient history. You're putting together what you feel is a reasonable hypothesis based on the data available. And if more data becomes available, then if you are a good scholar, you will say, okay, I have to revise, I have to rethink. And I think that's what good scholars do. So
in the relationship between, I guess, the library idea and that main community hypothesis, whether you want to identify them as Essenes or varieties of groups over time, which is one of the significant places of debate within that.
Absolutely, yeah.
The library identification is not built solely on it being one community, or is it more strongly tied to, the functions of a particular community because of the types of texts that we have that might indicate it's them, but doesn't preclude it being others? Like, how do you explain that type of mix?
Well, here we have to take a step back and we have to say, well, what kinds of texts, what types of texts were found there? I've already said religious texts, and I've already said manuscripts of books that later became part of the Jewish Bible. So, for example, we have 30 copies of the book of Deuteronomy. Okay. But then there are really kind of three other categories, three other categories, I'll say, that are found. And these categories, again, these are my categories. The people who live there, who put them in the caves, they don't categorize them. We can only, again, hypothesize about how they saw these texts in relation to each other. So the first important category after the biblical manuscripts are what has been called sectarian literature. And these are texts that have a particular vocabulary, a particular set of ideas that label them as not just general Jewish literature, but as belonging to a particular sect or group within Judaism. And they use language like that. They talk about themselves as the sons of light, and all other Jews are the sons of darkness. That's fairly obvious that they're separating themselves off. They also call themselves the Yachad, which in English would be the community. And so we know that they have a sense of separation from the rest of Judaism. Texts that fall into that category are found throughout the caves. And the major ones I think that people have heard of are the Serach HaYahad, or the community rule, the Damascus document, the rule of the congregation, the war scroll, those major texts. The fact that they are found throughout the 11 caves in various numbers, but indicate that this is one collection. It's not separate collections. The second category that I want to talk about is what I call the affiliated texts. And these are texts from the Second Temple period that don't have the particular sectarian vocabulary, but have ideas that these texts, the sectarian texts, are compatible with. And these are texts that some of them were known before Qumran, such as the books of Enoch, the book of Jubilees, but others were not, the Temple Scroll, for example. But all of these, they're not sectarian. They don't make a strong distinction between us and them, but yet they embrace things like the solar calendar as opposed to the lunar calendar. They talk about a particular way of understanding the Torah. The Damascus document, one of the sectarian texts, mentions the book of Jubilees by name, right? So these are texts that this community is reading and working with. Then the last category are kind of general Jewish texts. And they're hymns and prayers and psalms and things that any Jewish group could have used in this period in their religious life, whether in worship settings, study settings, school settings, anything like that. And in some cases, they actually might have been sectarian or affiliated, but they're so fragmentary that we just don't know. But those categories, when you look at the collection overall, give the scroll collection a particular flavor, right? It's not just anything. It belongs to a group, and it belongs to a particular time and place. And the emphases in that collection allow us to say some things about the group that produced them and that owned them. And it's the same thing that you could, if you went into a library of a seminary and you looked at what was there, and then you went into the library of a business school and you looked at what was there, you would say, oh, these are different groups, right? Because the emphases are clearly different. They might both carry the New York Times, but otherwise they're going to have very different emphases. And that's what we see at Qumran when we study the collection as a whole. And so then the question becomes, okay, this is a Jewish collection, but it's a group within Judaism. Who are they? Well, they call themselves the Sons of Light. They call themselves the community. They have other names that they use. But that doesn't, it helps us some. Mm-hmm. But we would like to know, in a broader sense, where they fit into Judaism more generally. And there we have to look at other bodies of literature. The classical texts that talk about Judaism, and there we have Josephus, the Jewish historian, Philo, the Jewish philosopher, and Pliny, the Roman geographer. We also need to look at the New Testament, right? We sometimes don't think about it, but the New Testament is a little later than Qumran, right? Paul's writing his first letters in the 40s and 50s. Qumran came to an end in 68, so there's a little overlap, but nevertheless, they are reflecting that first century CE world. So what did they have to say? And so we know that there were various groups within Judaism competing with each other, cooperating with each other, cooperating or not with the Romans, right? And so where does our group fit in? The best identification, although it is not certain ever, is the group that Josephus and Philo call the Essenes. And they identify them as one of three groups, or Josephus does, within Judaism, along with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And many of your listeners will probably be familiar with the Pharisees and Sadducees from the New Testament. Mm-hmm. So the Essenes are a third kind of sect or denomination within Judaism. And they had different ideas about how you interpret the Torah, how you live it. How you should associate with other Jews and with non-Jews, because of course that was part of their world. And so actually now we know more about this Qumran group than we know about the other two, because they left us their literature. So we know that they had a very strict approach to the law. And here's a very good example. In debates about the Sabbath law and how to keep the Sabbath, we know that the Pharisees said that you could save an animal from a ditch, or you could save a person, certainly, from drowning or from a ditch or whatever, on the Sabbath. This group says, well, you can save a person, but you can't use an implement to do that, right? You can't lower a ladder down into a pit to get them out. If you can pull them out, that's okay, but you can't use an implement, and you can't rescue an animal at all. So that's stricter, right? They can wait until the next day is sort of the attitude, which sounds very strange to us. But think of in the New Testament when Jesus heals on the Sabbath, and he gets debate. And it's not that people think healing is a bad thing, but whether or not you should do it on the Sabbath. Because if you're healing someone's crippled hand, that hand's been crippled a long time and it can wait another day. Whereas if you're saving someone's life, then that has to happen. And so we see in those emphases from Jesus' life that there was an ongoing debate all over about how to keep the Sabbath. And we see that in these documents from a much stricter attitude. Mm-hmm. So again, We have, we can say things about this group from what they say about themselves, and then also by comparing it to other bodies of literature at the same time.
Can I ask, as we wrap up here, you mentioned that these texts reflect in some ways the world of that first century, that they are a part of this literary phenomenon. And while the Dead Sea Scrolls get a lot of attention from the public because of their special presentation, their uniqueness,
Right.
the place that they are, there's all of these things. For scholars, that's also fascinating, but they add this other thing of the insight they give us into the development of texts over time. And so if I could kind of cross-plug to some work you have coming up to say, in that world of what do these texts, whether we understand them as a library, as individual pieces, how do they inform our understanding of the development of the literature of that first century world, and then to the literature that we still have and look back in today? How do you frame for someone who's thinking, well, they're their own things? I guess similar to that first introductory question of if you're just telling somebody what they are in a SparkNote version, and then now, a couple minutes later explaining how they fit into that text criticism world.
So that's a really good question, because this is, I think, you've touched on the question that scholars actually are much more interested in, right? But I'll just use the biblical texts as an example, right? The Dead Sea Scrolls, you'll read everywhere that among the Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest examples of biblical texts that we own in Hebrew. And that's by itself really important, because until the discovery of the scrolls, the oldest Hebrew manuscripts we had came from the medieval period. And the oldest Greek manuscripts came from the first and second centuries CE. Suddenly, because of the Qumran scrolls, we have much older texts. And that enables us to say, it enables us to say more, at least, about how did we get from the texts as they were composed, put together, redacted, whatever language you want to use, and the ones we have in our Bibles today, right? Whether we're reading the Hebrew or we're reading it in translation. And the scrolls really help us with that. They show us the history of the text as it went along. And so we can say that, for example, in the Pentateuch, there seems to have been 3 separate streams of tradition, one of which culminated in the Masoretic text, which is the canonical text of Judaism, one of which was translated into the Greek Septuagint, which became the canonical text in Orthodox Christianity, and of course was widely used by Greek-speaking Jews. And the third was selected by the Samaritan community as their canonical text, even though it was used by both Jews and Samaritans. It was chosen by the Samaritans. So now we can look at that and say, oh, there's a long history of development here. It's not that someone was just copying exactly through the centuries. No, there were changes, there was development, there was all kinds of expansions, in some cases omissions, mostly expansions, and scribal work on the texts. And that has been really important, not only for scholars, but in biblical translations. So, for example, many of your listeners will be familiar with the New Revised Standard Version and the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition. Both of those English translations took advantage of all the information that came from the Dead Sea Scrolls to introduce new and better translations in the Bible that people read. So it's not just kind of esoteric scholarly knowledge, but it really does affect the way people's own particular religious lives.
Yeah, they are such a fascinating artifact in many ways, but one that does contribute still to the ongoing life and relationship of people to texts in what feels like a really unique way. Like they are just so unique in almost every way that you come to them, whether their number, their location, their community, are they a library, their ongoing influence. Okay. The Dead Sea Scrolls are one of those things that just keep on giving. And so if you're listening to this and you're thinking...
They keep on giving. They've kept me interested now for 35 years, and I'm sure I will continue to be interested as my career goes along. I want to just introduce to you the whole idea of how digital and technological changes have begun to impact the study of the scrolls. Digital photography has enabled us to study the scrolls in new ways. X-ray technology, and this sort of is surprising, but X-ray technology enables scientists to take scrolls that were previously unopenable for whatever reason and X-ray through the layers and discover what the scroll was. And the most famous is a Leviticus scroll from Ein Gedi that was carbonized, that is, it was burnt, so it couldn't be opened. Now, with this X-ray technology, it can be read, and we know it's Leviticus. That's pretty interesting, and to say the least. And artificial intelligence is just being brought to bear on the scrolls. There are some large projects going on mainly in Israel and Europe that have to do with paleography and identification of unknown fragments and things like that. That's still really in its infancy, but I'm sure as time goes on, it'll get more and more important and give us more and more information.
And for someone who is looking for more, they are in luck because you have been publishing copious amounts on this. So if someone is looking for more and they're thinking, I would really love to hear more from you on this idea of libraries, well, I'd say you're in luck. You should check out Dr. Crawford's book, Scribes and Scrolls at Qumran, as a first stop among the other things that are out there. Dr. Crawford, thank you so much for taking the time to come and join us today to explain some of this. I think this library idea is just such a fascinating way to reframe something that maybe you feel like you know and shake it up into a whole new perspective, bring new light onto the community, their relationships. So thank you so much for taking the time to come and walk us through this today.
Thank you so much. It's been really fun to share this with you.
For all of you listening, thank you for tuning in. Be sure to check out Dr. Crawford's work. It's going to be linked down below. Like and subscribe wherever you find us. It helps us. Hopefully it helps you stay in touch with us. But for this week, that's all we have. Until next time.